Before 1857, getting a divorce required a private Act of Parliament, a process that cost at least £1,000, or equivalent to about £118,000 today. That sum was more money than most working-class families would see in a lifetime. For the poor, there were really only 5 ways to end a marriage. You could separate by mutual agreement, though this left both parties unable to remarry. Legally, you could desert. You could try for a legal separation through the church courts, which was expensive and didn't allow remarriage. You could die, or you could sell your wife. The practice emerged sometime in the late 17th century, likely born from desperation and reinforced by folk belief. Since the law treated women as property, some reasoned, why couldn't that property be transferred like any other? The ritual that developed was both humiliating and strangely dignified, a grotesque parody of both divorce and remarriage wrapped into one public ceremony. The selling typically began with an advertisement in the local newspaper, reading like livestock auctions. John Smith will sell his wife, Mary, at Doncaster Market on Tuesday next. She is healthy, strong, and of good character. No reasonable offer refused when, on the appointed day, the husband would lead his wife to a public place, usually a market square. The wife wore a halter around her neck, arm, or waist, usually made of rope, but sometimes of ribbon in a pathetic attempt at dignity. This halter wasn't just symbolic. It marked her as property to be transferred, no different from a cow or sheep. The auctioneer, often the husband himself, would call for bids. What am I offered for this fine woman? She's 26 years old, can bear children, excellent at needlework, and has all her teeth. The crowd would press closer, men examining the woman like potential buyers at a horse fair. But here's where the historical record reveals something crucial that changes our understanding of these scenes. In most cases, the sale was arranged in advance. The buyer was often the woman's lover, and the sale was actually a form of consensual divorce and remarriage rolled into one public ceremony. The humiliation was real, but it served a purpose. It made the separation publicly witnessed and, in the minds of the participants, legally binding. Consider the case documented in Brighton in 1826, which inspired Thomas Hardy's novel The Mayor of Casterbridge. A man sold his wife for £5 to a sailor. Oh, idiot. The newspaper reported that she seemed nothing loathed to go, and that the transaction was conducted with every appearance of good humor. The sailor had likely been courting her for months, and all 3 parties saw the sale as their only way to legally one relationship and begin another. In Wenlock Market in 1830, a wife sold for 2 shillings and 6pence was determined that the transaction should proceed despite her husband's last-minute doubts. She told him, "Let be, you rogue. I will be sold. I want a change." Her voice carries across the centuries, determined and fierce, seizing what little agency the law allowed her. The prices paid varied wildly, from a high of £100, over £18,000 today, to as little as a glass of ale. But the money wasn't really the point. What mattered was the public nature of the transaction, witnessed by dozens or sometimes hundreds of people who could later testify that the woman had been legally transferred from one man to another. The halter itself held deep symbolic meaning. After the sale, it was handed to the new husband as proof that the transaction was finished. This wasn't just theatre, it was a desperate attempt to create legal validity where none existed. Sometimes the ritual grew more elaborate, with bills of sale drawn up and signed. The ceremony often ended with all parties going to the nearest pub for a wedding feast, paid for by the new husband. But not every wife sale was a consensual arrangement. Some were genuine auctions where women found themselves bid upon by strangers. In 1824, in Manchester, a wife was sold for 5 shillings, but, not liking the purchaser, she was put up again for 3 shillings and a quart of ale. The woman's voice mattered. She could refuse buyers she found unsuitable. But imagine the terror of standing there while strangers bid on you like livestock. The practice was particularly strong in Yorkshire, where 27 of the 108 documented Victorian-era wife sales took place. Children weren't exempt from this trade. Wives were sometimes sold with their children included in the price. The authorities' response was inconsistent. Legally, the practice had no basis in law, but many local officials were uncertain about their authority to intervene. In 1819, when a magistrate tried to prevent a sale, he was pelted and driven away by the crowd. Some local officials even encouraged the practice. Poor law commissioners sometimes forced husbands to sell their wives rather than having the parish support separated families. The practice began to decline in the 1840s as social attitudes shifted and divorce became slightly more accessible. The rising middle class, uncomfortable with such public displays, pushed for prosecutions. By the 1850s, more sales were conducted privately by deed rather than public auction. The last recorded wife sale in England took place in 1913. By then, the practice was a relic. But the deeper horror of wife selling wasn't the ritual itself. It was what the ritual revealed about the society that made it necessary. These weren't savage customs practiced by barbarians. They were the logical response of rational people trapped in an irrational system. For the women who stood in those market squares with halters around their necks weren't victims of their husband's cruelty alone. They were victims of a legal system that refused to recognize their humanity. They endured the humiliation of being auctioned like livestock because it offered something the law denied them. A second chance. For a few shillings and the price of their dignity, they could legally become someone else's property. And perhaps, if they were lucky, that someone else would treat them as a human being rather than a possession. The historical record suggests that many wives actively participated in arranging their own sales. They weren't passive victims. They were active participants in the only form of divorce available to them. This doesn't make the practice any less horrifying, but it helps us understand why it persisted for over 2 centuries. When we look back at wife selling, it's easy to focus on the cruelty. The image of a woman with a rope around her neck being auctioned like livestock is the ultimate symbol of female oppression. And it was. But it was also something else. A community's attempt to create justice, where the law offered none. The practice died out not because society suddenly became more enlightened, but because legal divorce became slightly more accessible and because changing economic conditions gave women other options. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 began to chip away at coverture, allowing wives to keep their earnings and inherit property. But for the women who stood in those market squares in the early 19th century, those changes came too late. They lived in a world that offered them no legal identity, no right to their own earnings, no escape from violent or miserable marriages except through the degrading theater of public sale. Their stories remind us that the rights we take for granted were hard-won and came at an enormous cost. As you sit in your comfortable modern life, with your legal right to divorce and your ability to own property, remember the women who bought their freedom for a few shillings and the price of their dignity in the market squares of Victorian England. Remember that the rights you enjoy were built on the suffering of women who had no choice but to wear halters around their necks and hope that anyone, would treat them more kindly than the law did.